Do you think the Old West was hell for everyone? Think again. While men were dying in mines, shootouts, and land disputes, women had advantages nobody tells you about in the movies: scarcity, favorable laws, and an economy desperate for female presence created something unique in American history. Now see 20 advantages women had. Advantage 1. The math of scarcity. In 1850, California had 100,000 men and fewer than 8,000 women. Think about that. For every woman, there were at least 12 men competing for attention. In Nevada mining camps between I-89 and AD-70, that ratio got as high as 50-1. That changed everything. In a world where men were fighting over a piece of gold, a woman didn't have to fight for anything. She was the most valuable resource in the region. The one choosing the partner wasn't the man, it was her. And choosing is power. Economists who study markets where there's an imbalance between men and women, like in modern China, confirm it. The gender with fewer people always has the advantage. Better partners, more financial security, and more autonomy at home. In the Old West, that rule was in full force. Advantage 2. Widows' rights. Property. The East denied. In 1870, a married woman in the East couldn't own property in her own name. Everything belonged to her husband. But in the West, widows controlled ranches, mines, and entire businesses. Why? It wasn't idealism. Men died fast in the West. Accidents, disease, conflicts. If a widow couldn't inherit, the land had no legal owner, and the local economy fell apart. So territories like Wyoming created women's property laws years before the eastern states. Wyoming was also the first to give women the vote in 1869, partly to attract more women to the region. And many widows didn't just inherit, they thrived. Henrietta King took over the King Ranch after her husband's death and turned it into the largest private ranch in American history. Advantage 3. Business without permission. Impossible in the East. In 1870, a woman in Boston needed her father's or husband's signature just to open a store. Without that approval, it wasn't happening. Now, in Deadwood or Tombstone, nobody asked for any paperwork. If you had the money to get started, the business was yours. Simple as that. The West didn't have the East's bureaucracy, and that changed everything for anyone who wanted to work for themselves. Mattie Silks built an empire of entertainment houses in Denver that ended up being worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nellie Cashman opened hotels and restaurants in several mining towns and was so respected that no outlaw ever dared to rob her. And these weren't isolated cases. Historians have already identified more than 200 women running their own businesses in the West between 1860 and 1900, most of them in fields that would have been completely off-limits to them in the East. Advantage 4. Social immunity. The rules didn't apply. In a place where men killed each other over an argument at the bar, women walked through hostile territories without anyone laying a hand on them. And it wasn't because of chivalry. It was because of math. With so few women in the West, any guy who harmed one of them made enemies of every man within a 50-mile radius. Newspapers and diaries from the time show that women moved freely through areas where an unknown man would be met with gunfire. Belle Starr, known as the Bandit Queen, operated for years in rival gang territory, precisely because nobody wanted to carry the reputation of having killed a woman. And here's the surprising fact. Sociologist Randolph Roth showed in American Homicide that violence against women in the Old West was lower than in the eastern states during the same period. Scarcity created a shield that no law could offer. Advantage 5. Social mobility. Marriage as an elevator. In the East, you married someone from your own class, and that was that. In the West, the story was different. With 100 men competing for every available woman, An immigrant who arrived without a penny could end up married to the owner of the biggest mine in the region. And this happened all the time. County records between 1850 and 1880 prove marriages that crossed social classes at a frequency that would have been unthinkable in the East. In Comstock Lode, Nevada, in the 1860s, there are several documented cases of women who arrived with nothing and were courted by men sitting on mining fortunes. This pattern repeats across every frontier with a shortage of women, from 19th century Australian colonies to Alaska in the 1970s. Where women were scarce, the result was always the same. They moved up the social ladder in a way that money alone could never buy. Advantage 6. Teaching, the only job with equal pay. Here's a fact most people don't know. In the Old West, teaching was the only profession where a woman could earn the same as a man, or even more. Not because of fairness, but for one very simple reason. Almost no men wanted the job. Every new town that popped up needed a school, and educated women became the obvious candidates. In many regions, female teachers earned more than cowboys because they were rare and better prepared than the few men available. The market worked in their favor. Records from Western territories between 1860 and 1880 show that women filled more than 60% of teaching jobs in communities with fewer than 500 residents, and earned on average 15% more than male teachers in those same regions. Pure law of supply and demand. Advantage 7. Mail order brides, the power to choose your destiny. In the East, a woman married whoever came along. In the West, she chose from dozens of desperate suitors. The mail order bride system worked like this. A lonely man on the frontier placed an ad in a newspaper looking for a wife. The problem for him was that few women responded, and the ones who did received piles of letters from different candidates, miners, farmers, merchants, all competing for the attention of one single woman. She could compare offers, weigh financial conditions, and even negotiate where she would live. Marriage agency records from the time reveal something surprising. Women who used this system often married men much wealthier than any suitor they would have had in the East. The shortage of women turned marriage into a reverse auction, and the woman was the one calling the shots. Advantage 8. Divorce, more favorable laws in the West. In the East in the 1870s, a divorced woman was treated like a social outcast. She carried a stigma that destroyed reputations and closed doors. But in the Old West, the story was completely different. Territories like Nevada created divorce laws that were much simpler than those in the East. The process was fast. Residency requirements were minimal, and a woman could end a bad marriage without losing everything. And here's the detail that changes everything. With so few women available on the frontier, no man was going to reject a woman just because she had been married before. There were too many men wanting to get married for any prejudice to last. Nevada became a divorce destination for Americans even back then, and that tradition never stopped. To this day, the state still has the most liberal divorce laws in the country, a direct legacy of those Old West days. Advantage 9. Inheritance and property. The West got ahead of the future. In the eastern United States, when a woman got married, she basically disappeared in the eyes of the law. Everything she owned automatically passed to her husband. But in the West, territories like Wyoming and Colorado began recognizing women's right to property. And it wasn't out of kindness. In 1869, Wyoming became the first territory to guarantee women the vote and property rights. The reason was simple. These places desperately needed women in order to grow. If Western laws were as bad as the ones in the East, no woman would have had a reason to go. It was pure market logic, and it worked. This wave of laws that began in the West in the 1860s took decades to reach the eastern states. Necessity made the West move forward on rights the rest of the country still resisted accepting. Advantage 10. Boarding houses, the most profitable business available. When a town sprang up in the West, the first people to arrive slept on the ground, in tents or in stables. Miners, cowboys, and merchants needed a bed and a hot meal, but almost no one offered that. Women spotted this gap before any man did. With little startup money, a boarding house already had customers before it even opened. The work was hard, cooking for dozens, doing laundry, keeping order. But it was something they knew how to do, and the return was guaranteed. While miners gambled everything on a nugget that might never come, boarding house owners had steady income every week. Historian D. Brown pointed out that boarding houses were the most common business among successful women of the period, surpassing any other female-run enterprise of the time. Advantage 11. Medicine and nursing, unique authority. In the heart of the Old West, most towns didn't have a single doctor. When someone got shot, broke a leg, or a child was about to be born, the person saving lives was the woman who knew herbs, home remedies, and childbirth techniques. Midwives and healers became indispensable figures in these isolated communities. And here's the detail that changes everything: that authority didn't depend on money or a last name. The richest rancher in the region and the poorest cowboy depended on that woman equally in moments of desperation. Records from the time show that the local medicine woman held a social position no other resident could reach. It didn't matter where she came from or how much she owned. Her power came from something no one else had: the knowledge that separated life from death when there was no one else to call. Advantage 12. Entertainment, artists, and performers. In mining towns where there were 20 men for every woman, any woman who stepped onto a stage was guaranteed a packed house. Miners spent weeks isolated and paid fortunes for a night of entertainment. Singers and actresses charged fees that no other female profession came close to. Lotta Crabtree started performing in the California gold fields as a teenager in the 1850s. Miners threw gold nuggets onto the stage instead of applauding. She built up wealth city by city, and when she died in 1924, she was one of the richest women in the United States. Lily Langtry traveled through the West and was welcomed like royalty. Judge Roy Bean even renamed a town in Texas after her. While men risked their lives digging for gold, these women got rich entertaining the ones who were digging. Advantage 13. Legal testimony, words that carried more weight. In an Old West courtroom, a woman's word could decide who went to the gallows and who went home. Not because the law said so, but because no lawyer wanted to be seen attacking a woman in front of a jury. The chivalry that worked in the streets also worked inside the courtroom. Judges and jurors had a natural resistance to doubting what a woman said. Contradicting her in public was seen as cowardice, almost as serious as raising a hand to her. Defense lawyers knew that pressuring a female witness could turn the jury against their own client. Trial records from the time show that women's testimony was challenged far less often than men's in the same situations. In practice, this gave them enormous power. Their words simply carried more weight on the scales of justice. Advantage 14. Churches, exclusive community power. In the Old West, before there was a town hall, a courthouse, or any public office, there was already a church. And the people running the day-to-day life of the church weren't the pastor, they were the women. They organized gatherings, decided who received help when they were going through hard times, and built the ties between families. In a town with no other institution up and running, that meant real power. Records from frontier communities show that these women influenced decisions about where to build the school, how to handle health issues, and even land disputes. No political office in the East would have given them that same influence. The pulpit belonged to the preacher, but the real social control of the community was in their hands. Advantage 15. Pioneer photography, an open profession. Here's something most people don't know. While medicine, law, and engineering were closing their doors to women, a new profession was opening a wide path in the Old West: photography. Between 1860 and 1890, the industry was too young to have created barriers against them. And look what happened. Women opened their own studios in mining towns and made fortunes. Every guy who struck it, rich in a gold rush, wanted a portrait to send back to his family in the East, guaranteed customers. The Smithsonian and Library of Congress archives record dozens of these professionals between 1860 and 1900. The lesson is clear. When a profession is new, no one has had time to invent rules to exclude anyone. Advantage 16. Journalism. At the major newspapers in the East, a woman trying to publish anything was ignored before she even opened her mouth. But at the small newspapers in frontier towns, the story was completely different. These papers ran with tiny staffs and desperately needed content to fill their pages. If a woman wrote well, the editor published it without thinking twice. It wasn't about ideology. It was about business survival. Several women became well-known voices in their communities by writing for these local papers. They gave their opinions on politics, trade, and land disputes with an authority no Eastern editor would have allowed. When Nellie Bly began her career in Pittsburgh in the 1880s and shocked the world, this model of the female journalist had already been common in Western towns for years. Necessity always beat prejudice. Advantage 17. Cost of living. Men paid for everything. In mining and frontier towns, the ratio reached as high as 100 men for every woman. This created something no economics book really explains properly: brutal competition among men for simple female attention. Any woman who arrived in one of these places quickly realized she almost never had to pay for anything. Meals, drinks, transportation, gifts, everything showed up without her asking. And the important detail, these men weren't boyfriends or formal suitors. They were simply men trying to stand out in a market where the female supply was almost zero. Diaries and letters from the time confirm this openly. Women wrote about the absurd number of gifts they received from men they barely knew. Some used this informal economy intelligently, accumulating enough resources to open their own businesses. Advantage 18. Child custody. The West was decades ahead. In the East in the 1870s, if a couple separated, the children went to the father. That was the law. The mother could have raised those children by herself for years, but legally she had no rights at all. In the Western territories, the story was different. Mothers already had recognized custody decades before the rest of the country, and the reason wasn't kindness. Men died young in the West. Accidents, conflicts, disease. Communities that needed to grow couldn't afford to leave children without a mother figure because of an outdated law. So they created their own rules that kept mothers and children together. The Uniform Custody Act, which later standardized maternal rights across the entire U.S., had its roots precisely in those Western territorial laws. Necessity did what Eastern conservatism took decades to accept. Advantage 19. Community support. In the Old West, there was no government taking care of anyone. No hospital, no insurance, no social assistance. When someone got sick, lost their harvest, or died, the people who showed up at the door with food, medicine, and help were the women in the neighborhood. They formed support networks through sewing groups, church circles, and local associations that functioned as the only real welfare system in those communities. Men did help each other too, but in a one-off and disorganized way. Women operated as a network. They knew who was pregnant, who was sick, who needed what. A woman well-positioned in that circle had access to a level of support no man could achieve on his own. These female structures worked for decades before any government program even existed. Advantage 20. Female outlaws. Above suspicion. Belle Starr was involved in crime for decades and was convicted only once, with a sentence so light it almost seemed like a joke. Pearl Hart robbed a stagecoach and became a celebrity instead of an ordinary prisoner. The reason was simple. The law didn't take women seriously as criminals. Sheriffs and judges treated women as naturally fragile, incapable of planning real crimes. That created a huge blind spot. Women carried messages between gangs, hid stolen money, and gave shelter to fugitives with almost no risk of being searched or arrested. A man doing the same thing would be searched or arrested on the spot. The social protection that existed for honest women worked the same way for dishonest ones. The system that claimed to protect women ended up shielding the very ones operating outside the law.